My name's JRandallMoorman. I'm a clinical cardiologist at the University of Virginia. And the first slide, perhaps I should do that, shows my disclosures. I am associated with companies that have or will commercialize some of the ideas that I'll talk about today. It also shows some advertisements, a society and a journal that I'm very proud to be associated with. Now, I say that I'm speaking on behalf of many people, and this is a current directory of most of them. I'll draw attention to a few names: Doug Lake, a mathematician; Karen Fairchild and John Catwinkle, neonatologists; Morris Calland, whom you already know from today; and Travis Moss, a cardiology fellow that's also with us today. This group of people is comprised of doctors, nurses, engineers, quantitative scientists, students, house officers, postdocs, a large and dedicated group that has been working on these kinds of projects for as long as 15 years. Our mission is very simple. We wish to save lives. We wish to save the lives of premature infants and of adults hospitalized in ICU beds and in hospital beds as well. This mission informs and clarifies all the decisions and actions that we undertake. It's the only thing that we really care about doing. The way that we do this is by developing and validating predictive algorithms. That is to say, computer models of mathematical equations that use clinical measurements as inputs, and the output is the probability of a subacute, potentially catastrophic illness. An analogy that we can all relate to is weather forecasting, where computer models use current and past conditions as inputs, and the output is the probable state of the weather. We devised these algorithms based on precepts that I think all clinicians would agree about, and that is that apparently sudden critical illness can have subtle and subclinical prodromes, which, if diagnosis can be made and treatment undertaken at that time, outcomes should logically improve. Now, I'm going to tell you a story that I hear a lot that will make these things come together, but first I'm going to set the stage for it. I'm not a clinical neonatologist, but this question, is this baby septic, is a very common question in the neonatal ICU. Now, you might legitimately ask, what baby are you talking about? Most babies in the NICU have their incubators covered up a great deal of the time, and even if you find the baby, shown in the lower right-hand part, you may not be any closer to answering your question as to whether or not that baby is sick. But that doesn't mean that the question is not important. It's terribly important. It is a dire illness. The mortality doubles. It's the most common cause of unexpected death in the NICU. Now take this problem child and multiply up by all of the babies that you have in your NICU, and you can see what a difficult problem it is to try to understand which of these patients is sick. Now, some years ago, we developed a predictive monitor for the diagnosis of neonatal sepsis based on mathematical analysis of heart rate characteristics time series, and this is what the result looks like. This is a floor plan of our NICU. Every rectangle is a bed spot, and the orange stuff are data points that give to the clinicians our estimate of the risk of neonatal sepsis in the next 24 hours. Now, the spirit of the use of this, to some extent, is to look at beds like B11 and B14, which have low and stable scores, and imagine that those babies are doing well. Or to look at other beds, such as B9 and B10, where the scores are high. These infants are probably ill, and you probably already know about that. The real spirit of the use of this predictive monitor and any other that we'll talk about is to draw attention to infants that might be getting sick and you didn't know it. And the phenotype of that is a low score that starts to rise. So A4 has done that twice. A5 has done that yesterday. The use of this monitor would lead to increased scrutiny or another visit to the bedside of those babies with the idea of sepsis in mind. Now, I'm ready to tell you the story that I hear. NICU doctors and nurses come up to me and say, we had a baby and the baby was fine and the score started to go up, so we went to look at the baby and the baby still looked fine. but we understood about the monitor, so we drew lab tests and blood cultures, and the lab tests were all normal, but the blood culture came back positive for, say, Serratia marcescens, a gram-negative organism. The story continues. We gave the baby antibiotics, and get this, the baby never got sick. Now, I use Serratia in that example, although other organisms appear in that story, because that was the organism growing in the blood of the first infant at NICU diagnosed and treated for neonatal sepsis without ever getting sick. Serratia neonatal sepsis has a mortality approaching 40%, the same as a very major heart attack, and yet that infant never got sick. Now that is a great story. I got a chill the first time I ever heard that story. I'm getting a chill telling it to you now. The idea that these patients can develop lethal illnesses and be diagnosed and treated and never suffer at all, that is a story that motivates us every day, and I believe that you can see why I would say that. Now, great a story as that is, it is only a story, and to find out more about the impact of this on infants, we conducted a randomized trial. We conducted, in fact, the largest randomized clinical trial ever conducted in premature infants for any reason. 3,000 infants in 9 NICUs, more than 100 doctors, more than 1,000 nurses. And the clinical trial was simply to either show the predictive monitor that I just showed you, or to not show it and let conventional care go forward. The results were that display of the predictive monitor with no other intervention other than turning on the computer screen reduced the mortality from 10.2% to 8.1%. That is to say, we saved 1 baby's life for every 48 babies less than 1,500 grams that we turned it on for, every 23 babies less than 1 kilogram that we turned it on for, and for every 12 infants who became septic. This, to my knowledge, is the only demonstration of its kind that the use of continuously available data, mathematically analyzed and represented to the clinicians, actually improves outcomes. Now, we have proven this principle, and we have over the past few years moved on to a much larger problem, and that is predictive monitoring in adults with the same goals. Now, here are the illnesses that we are interested in: sepsis, bleeding that leads to large transfusion, or lung failure that leads to emergency intubation. We're interested in 2 venues, a medical ICU and the surgical ICU. Now, look at the impacts of these events on the outcomes of patients. No less than a 3-fold increase in the amount of ICU stay, no less than a 3-fold increase in mortality. If you are in our medical ICU and you have lung failure leading to emergency intubation, the mortality is 50%. Now, that's not just an educated guess on my part. That's based on our analysis of a large data set, more than 7,000 patients with upwards of 1,000 of these events. We collect all of the monitoring data and store it. This leads to scores of terabytes of data. We have a large dedicated high-performance computing cluster that we use to generate algorithms with, but it's important to know that you don't need that kind of computer to render this kind of monitoring at the bedside. The algorithms are efficient and lend themselves to ordinary kinds of desktop computing and handheld devices, for that matter. Now, the way that we go about developing these algorithms is similar to what we do in the NICU. We look at them and try to see patterns that represent illness signatures prior to illness. Now, on this plot, I'm showing you the things that we measure. There are 4 vital signs there: the blood pressure, the heart rate, the oxygen saturation, and the respiratory rate. Their means are represented, their variabilities are represented, their cross correlations are represented, and I've summarized by the word entropy a number of nonlinear dynamical analyses that we use. Now, sensible clinicians would be able to get a running start on filling this out. So, for example, we would guess that bleeding would sign itself with a falling blood pressure and a rising heart rate, and that lung failure would sign itself with a rising respiratory rate and a falling oxygen concentration. But none of us, no matter how sensible or experienced, could completely fill this out nor do so truly quantitatively. But we have big data, and we have a big computer, and this is what we got. And I'm showing you the results generated by Travis Moss in our group. So the colors of the tiles represent the direction and the strength of the association of the measurement with the outcome. So this deep orange means that falling blood pressure is strongly associated with upcoming sepsis, upcoming bleeding, and this blue color means that rising heart rate is also associated with upcoming bleeding. You can tell from this that some measures go in one direction for one illness and another direction for another, but that within the medical and the surgical ICU, the diagnoses have consistent signatures between them. Now, we can use this for a couple of reasons. We can use this to understand associations between physiology and illness, and we should. But another thing that we can use this for is to use them as statistical tools to help us in the care of our own patients. That is to say, measure these things in our patients, use these mathematical models to tell us who is at increasing risk. Now, we aim to beat the current art. Everyone with an electronic health record will be familiar with this kind of synopsis of time series of vital signs. But I will tell you for myself that I find it hard to get a gestalt on whether this patient is getting worse under my eyes. And then again, multiply that up by all the patients in my surgery ICU, and it's very hard for me to tell at a glance who is getting worse. Here's a representation that we've developed at the University of Virginia that we hope improves upon this problem. So represented here are all of the patients in our surgery ICU, represented by their bed number. On this axis is the risk of lung failure leading to emergency intubation. The units are fold increase with respect to average. On this axis, the risk of bleeding leading to large transfusion. We represent the current state of the patient by the head of this icon, and we put the bed number there. We draw a tail to show how the last 3 hours have gone. These things look like comets. We call them comets. The idea is that if they are going up and out, they are getting worse. And if they are going up and out with long tails, it means they're getting worse fast. Now, I'm going to take you through a day in the life of our surgery trauma burn ICU from a few weeks ago. These are real data, and the stories I'm going to tell you really did happen. The clinicians caring for the patients did not have this display to look at and rendered conventional care in standard kinds of means. There are a number of stories here. I'm just going to tell you a couple of them. Now, here at 7 o'clock in the morning, the arrow points to bed 88, and this is the patient that I'll have the most to say about. This is a patient who's undergone 3 major abdominal procedures in the past 5 days for complications of Crohn's disease, and he was extubated this morning. Through this day, hour by hour, his clinical issues are respiratory, and there's a good deal of attention from the respiratory therapists. And as the day goes on, he gets better and he gets worse with their attentions. Now, at 7 o'clock in the evening, a new player arrives that in bed 93, the victim of a car crash. His blood counts have dropped since his admission to the emergency room 3 hours ago. Now, the next hour at 8 o'clock, the patient in bed 88 is stable clinically. That is to say, there is no serious concern about the fact that the respiratory rate has risen from the 20s to the 30s, and it is not until fully 2 hours later that the ICU attending is called to the bedside because the breathing is very labored indeed. An X-ray shows partial lung collapse, a bronchoscopy is ordered, the patient declines at least for an hour or two, and then it becomes sicker, consents to bronchoscopy. He is extubated, importantly, immediately thereafter, and starts to improve. Now, in the meantime, in bed 90, a patient with a tracheostomy who's undergoing trach collar trials has a complication of large emesis, and this respiratory status is not remarked upon clinically, but we would think that his risk of lung failure has gone up. At this time, at midnight, bed 93's hemoglobin has now fallen to 9 from an initial value of 15. transfusions begin, and they will continue through the rest of the night. So now we're in the wee hours of the morning. 93 starts to make a turn for the better. But here at 7 o'clock, the patient in bed 88 all of a sudden has a very great deal of respiratory distress. Attendings are brought to the bedside. The patient is intubated not long thereafter. And here at 9 o'clock, where I'm going to stop the story, things have settled. 88 is better because he is intubated. 93 is better because he is transfused. Now, would the display of that information have affected the care of those patients? Well, I don't know, but it's not unreasonable to speculate that the patient in bed 88 might have had the attendings called in closer to 8 o'clock when the comet went up than 2 hours later, and it's not unreasonable to speculate that the patient in bed 93 might have started his transfusions earlier. Now I'm going to conclude by proposing that this kind of work is relevant to healthcare in the United States, in as much as we see opportunities for the components of HHS to federate around the idea of using big data to take care of the patient at the bedside. To ONC, I would say that this is a great example of the use of healthcare information technology. To NIH, that this is a possible engine for discovery of fundamental knowledge to enhance health. To the FDA, we might contemplate a multi-center laboratory to set standards to evaluate these monitors and their interfaces. And to CMS, that this is a great example of how data-driven anticipatory analytics might impact the care of the individual patient. Thank you all for coming today. Thank you for your attention to this. Now let's go change the world.